Oh, fuck.
Sorry. I have to check this email. I just got an email that says I have to report all my work for the last week.
Is it from Balaki?
No, it's from E Musk.
Oh, fuck.
Sorry. I was trying to figure out a way to work that joke in so bad.
Oh, now it's part of the recording. Great job, Martin.
I haven't been censored in a while. I had to do something.
It's time for Bourbon with Friends, the bourbon podcast that never takes itself too seriously. Pull up a chair, grab a glass, and remember, a bourbon with friends can change the world. Here we go.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Bourbon with Friends. Myself, Adrian, and Martin are here to talk about whiskeys from around the world and how a bourbon friend or whiskey can change the world. How was your guys' weekend?
Great, man. It was good. It was good.
That was so energetic, Martin.
I was trying to figure out what
to show you're making jokes about Elon Musk and taxes, or you're working in time, but now you can. You're like, okay.
I know. No, I don't know what to say. No, it was good. I went out with some friends on Friday to a good old Indiana dive bar. So now I smell like cigarettes for the next week.
Got your level of shabuzi filled, right?
Listen, I'm going to tell you something about Shabuzi. The man doesn't have other songs. I'm convinced of it. Like, that is the only song he has because...
Pour me a double shot of whiskey. I got a sign here. It says make it a double. Like,
what does he say?
There's a reason for that.
He says him and Jack Daniels have a history. They friends or something? I don't know.
I don't know.
Such a bad fucking song.
Shut your mouth there.
It's such a bad song. Like,
you shut your mouth.
It's not like,
it's not a bad song. It's catchy. It's just been overplayed. That's all.
It's such a, yeah.
That's all.
But yeah, I got my fill of Shabuzi. I got my fill of cigarette smoking and cheap beer, but it was a lot of fun. So that's what I did is I went out into the world. Adrian, what did you do with your Indiana weekend?
I was slinging cocktails at Edmund Cove. So
God, you said tails because that had been wild.
Yeah, just making cocktails. That's all I was doing. It was good. It was actually pretty busy considering
really?
It's a Saturday in February. So I'm not mad about it. It was good.
Any new cocktails on the menu you want to talk about? At Edwin Co. Spirits?
Well, I did make, so we have a cocktail on the menu called a Revolver. And then when I got home on Saturday night, I did make a couple of those at home. So that was good. Journeyman makes a wonderful coffee liqueur that I use to make those. So it was very, very good.
Yeah.
That does sound good. Now I want one.
And I don't even like coffee all that much, but that does sound
super easy. Super easy cocktail.
Mm-hmm. I don't have anything. I don't have a lead in.
Wow.
I just realized that.
Well,
you do it. You do it.
No, I didn't help you. So
no, I got thrown off. Sorry.
So I met with the the general in charge of the 10th Mountain Division this weekend.
Oh,
so
nice.
they were out here for the 10th Mountain Days in Vail. So I was able to meet with him and a bunch of his soldiers and the command sergeant major. So that was really cool. And it was a new and exciting experience for everybody on my staff and everybody that worked for my distillery. So with that, I think it could be a new perspective on a different riff.
Maybe a new riff.
A
new riff.
It's possibly a new riff and how you move things along.
Yep. And if you guys haven't seen the title of this as you're watching this podcast, our guest today is Brian Sprance of New Riff. So there we go. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Yeah.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yep,
thanks for being on.
Welcome.
Absolutely.
So we always like to start out.
Friends, though.
Yeah.
What's that?
I said bourbon with new friends right now, but I'm sure we'll be friends in about one bourbon.
Oh,
yeah.
Gotcha.
Yes, I agree. You're not wrong. So we'd like to start out with just to have you tell a little bit about yourself and maybe give us the spin on how New Riff became the name of the distillery.
Sure. So I came out of the brewing industry. I spent the first 9 years of my brewing career at a small brewery in Cincinnati called the Barrel House Brewing Company. A little bit before their time, but we were located over the Rhine. They actually opened in 1995. I started working there in 1999 when I got out of college. Kind of did the whole work my way up from the bottom. Really loved beer. Obviously drank a good amount of beer in college, but I was always kind of fascinated with like working with your hands, making stuff, things like that. I met my wife to be at the time there. She was a bartender and she said, "Hey, we need someone to drive a truck around and deliver some kegs." And I was like, I could probably knock that one out. Did that for a few. And then as things kind of went along, a position opened where it was, "Hey, do you want a keg beer? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that?" So that was really like my introduction to the brewing industry. Jumped in kind of head first. Loved doing it. Loved every part of it. Was there we were a small brew pub. We were making about 2,500 barrels of beer. So nothing crazy, but this was pretty early on in kind of the craft brewing scene of what I would call Cincinnati. But after, I think it was 5 or 6 years, we changed ownership. We moved not far, a couple blocks away, and try to give it a go at like kind of being a regional brewery. We started bottling and trying to like get into the distribution game. So I really had like a kind of a very good understanding of like what I tell people, like kind of the creative side of like the arts and crafts of making beer. I didn't know a ton of technical things at the time about what I was learning, but I knew that I loved working with my hands. I knew that I loved, a lot of it is cleaning. A lot of it is, the last thing that you actually do, at least in my experience in the brewing industry, was actually making the beer. So it went from like cleaning the floors to cleaning the kegs to filling the kegs to I get to clean a tank. Eventually made my way up onto what we called the brew deck and started really like falling in love with like actually the process of making beer. Like I said, I was there for a little under 9 years. We changed ownership. It didn't go the way that I really wanted to like continue with. And at that time, I kind of looked around in Cincinnati and there wasn't a ton of options. At that time, I guess it was 2007, where the Barrel House had relocated to was about 3 blocks away from this really big historic brewery. It was the Hutable Shanling Brewery that Boston Beer, aka Samuel Adams, bought. There was a couple other smaller breweries kind of like bubbling to the surface back in the day. But I wanted to go learn like kind of process management, people management, the other things that like I thought were important in the manufacturing of beer. So I took a job there and I very unceremoniously got tossed into learning how to make twisted tea, clear malt beverages, ciders, but a lot of the things that like really like kind of like, I don't know, scratched like the creative itch of like really fermentation and flavor development and things like that. Loved what I was doing there. And also like Boston Beer was a very, very, very good company to work for. After doing that for about 4 years or so, I wanted to get back into beer. It was a union shop, so I couldn't really necessarily make the beer, but I could learn how to be a brewing supervisor, which was basically like kind of like, I don't know, being a head coach of something, if that's a good analogy. You're not necessarily allowed to like do the things to make the beer, but all the technical things and all the process stuff kind of came our way. And those were our ways of like kind of like figuring it out. Plus like Boston Beer was such like a dynamic company and they still continue to be. They just make so many things. And there was just so many interesting things to like kind of like get your hands into. Worked there for about 6 years. And at that time, I kind of looked around again and I was just like, I don't know, what else is there? I'd worked for a small brewery that made 2,500 barrels of beer. I also worked for a brewery that was capable of making 1 million barrels of beer a year. So I felt like I had a pretty well-rounded skill set. That being said, I remember like to the day, like telling my wife, I'm like, I don't know what I want to do. Maybe I'll just go drive a cab for a while and figure it out. Serendipitously, at the same time that this was all going on, New Riff was under construction. Ken Lewis, who owns the Party Source, is in the process of basically building a distillery, expanding the Party Source, which I think is one of still the biggest beverage alcohol stores in the company.
Yeah.
But he was also adding a brewery into the back end of it. I'll probably use the word serendipitous too much, but I think it's very true in a lot of these stories. He hired one of like my dear friends to be the head brewer of the brewery that was going back into the back of Party Source. And through that connection, he said, "Hey man, this guy is an amazing human being, one of like the great entrepreneurial like spirits that I've ever met, but they're opening a distillery and they're kind of looking for somebody with your skill set, kind of like the creative, like artistic side of like craft brewing, which I kind of hold romantic. I don't know if that's necessarily like true or accurate, but it's how I feel. So that's true and to me, and that's all that matters." But he said they're looking for somebody with your skill set of kind of the small brewery, the big brewery, also with a lot of fermentation experience. He said, if it's not you that sits down and talks to him, then it's probably going to be one of your friends. And I was like, I can't have one of my friends get one over on me. So I sat down and I sat down and talked to Ken Lewis, and hopefully you guys one day like get the chance to get him on here. But he's an amazing, inspirational, entrepreneurial guy. He said, I'm starting this company. He can't own manufacturing and retail. I don't think anywhere in the United States, but correct me if I'm wrong, but at least in Kentucky, you can't own a massive liquor store next to a distillery that you're opening up. So he actually turned the Party Source into an ESOP. Yeah. So it could have been very easy. He could have very easily just sold the business to his competitors who, a lot of what I learned from Ken was he has so much faith, trust, and belief in the people that he hires. He'll be the first one to tell you, I didn't build that company. I mean, obviously he did, but he gives so much credit to everyone that works within the company, whether it goes from like stocking like the shelves of like single malt whiskeys to all these other things. It takes a village to do a lot of these bigger things. And he always gave so much credit to all of these other people. So he didn't want his legacy to be, I sold it to and then they came in and fired all the people that I thought really helped me build this into a successful company. Seeing how he dealt with that was also, pretty inspirational. But when we sat down and looked at like kind of the nuts and the bolts of like, all right, there's like 7 or 8 of us at this point. Like no one has any experience in actually like making whiskey. I didn't even drink whiskey when I took the job here. I tell people a lot of times, like when I was getting ready to sit down and talk with him, I was like reading books about, like, I envisioned that I was going to be sitting there in like the corner of like this Party Source, like running a pot still. It was not. He was like, this is where we're going to have a 60-foot beer still. And I kind of like looked at like my phone, like, what is a beer still? I don't know these things. Like I've been a brewer for 15 years, but like just sitting down and like listening to his vision of what he wanted to do, which was very new. I mean, there's a lot of heritage. There's a lot of history to like Kentucky distilleries. And like, that was 2013 when I first sat down and talked to him. Just to have somebody kind of give you a vision of like what they see was very inspiring to me. So I walked away from that first initial interview just being like, wow. Thought about it for a couple of days and then kept following up and saying, hey, I'd like to sit down. And, he didn't make me wait or anything like that, but like, it was very much like serendipitous because Mitchell Doherty, who was the head brewer at the brewery in the back of the Party Source, dear friend of mine, gave me the connection into here. And I had kind of the skill sets that he was looking for. But honestly, once I sat down and talked to him, as well as Jay Ersman, who's the co-founder of New Riff, it kind of felt like one of those like kind of all-in moments. I think I was the right age. It was the right time. I felt a little bit like kind of burnt out and tired of making beer. And it seemed, you hear the expression a lot, like whiskey is what beer wants to be when it grows up. And I don't know, like I kind of, sometimes you just
like that.
circumstances or situations in life where you're like, is this really real? so I took the job. The building was still under construction. And that's where we really just started building what the company is from the ground up. So
that's awesome.
That is good. It's like crazy.
The name?
Yeah, the name.
Yep. Yeah. So does the name have like
so that's probably something we're still working on defining.
That's okay. That's okay. I love the name. I just was curious if it had any, sentimental significance even, just curiosity.
Sure. It does, like, I think if like, and this has been explained to us by other people, because kind of like, sometimes what's in front of your face, you don't see very clearly. But when like people started like talking to us about like our logo, like we're a river town, we're sitting on the Ohio River. New as in we're a very new distillery in the grand scope of all these heritage distilleries that are around Kentucky. They have hundreds of years of history. We didn't have that, but like when you kind of look at like what is new, what is old, what is a riff, like the musical riff, we kind of started looking at some of this stuff and going, oh, is this kind of like it like kind of looks like a musical like kind of note, but also does that like kind of curve look like maybe something like the river, and then something new that we're trying to carve into. And again, like you guys can't hold me to any of these explanations, because you can probably talk to like 10 other people at New Riff and they'll have their own explanation.
That's kind of cool in itself.
Like
anyway, I kind of like that too. So
to me,
I love it.
It was something absolutely new, and it was our opportunity to riff on something that is like it's so embedded in like just cultural history. It's bourbon whiskey and rye whiskey. We're not going to come in out of the gate in like 2014 and be like, we're the greatest distillery ever. It felt new to us. It was also a time, I think, that like there weren't a lot of like us, as in us, like our sizes kind of popping up in Kentucky. This was 2014. So like we had a lot of people that were curious about what we were up to as well. So we actually got a lot of like the legends and, the historians and all these people, all these great people from like kind of like the history of like Kentucky whiskey making. We had them come up here. So the TLDR is it was something new, and you can't rewrite how to make a straight whiskey. There's only so many things you can do to it, but we can try to make our riff on it. And our riff was that we were independent, family owned, and we were going to try to do some new things that like, honestly, we didn't know if they were going to do well or not. We didn't have we didn't have the bar set for us. We didn't have a baseline of like, well, people have done this and people have done that. We were kind of, we tried to figure a lot of stuff out on our own. Naive might be a good description of how we did it. But like, like we kind of took like the 30,000 foot view of like, okay, well, you can make whiskey. Okay. It's got to be corn, rye, wheat, barley, something like that. Like it seemed like there was a lot more avenues to explore for us. And I reference like a lot of times, like my brewer toolbox, where you work with like 50, 75, 100 different grains a year. You work with all kinds of different yeast strains. You work with all of these other things. And when like you have a team put together, and, at the time I was the only one that had like the manufacturing experience. When I remember like sitting down and telling Ken, like, I've thought about this. This is what I want to do. This is so cool. He literally looked at me and went, like, are you talking to me, dude? Like, this is your job. Like, this is what I hired you for. And like, just to like, kind of like have somebody give you like that kind of creative freedom is terrifying, but it was also like, it was like very, very like, I don't know, liberating or freeing. Those might be just stretch of words, but like when I worked with so many other brewers, a lot of us were stomping around. I just wish I could do what I wanted to do sometimes. And when somebody says, do what you want to do, you're like, oh, yeah. Oh, okay.
Okay. Let me take a new riff on this.
Right. I was 36 at the time, and I was like, okay, let's go. I mean, you hired me, but
that's awesome.
It is good. Well, you almost started to get into the question I had for you, my friend. So talking about you guys started 2014.
Yep.
And looking at that landscape, obviously, I mean, you got an insane amount of history in Kentucky with bourbon whiskey in general. But one thing I discovered you guys in 2019, I think it was. At the time I was living in Texas. I'll remember that. And we're going to talk about your bottle design later on, because that is 100%. I will, anything matte black, I will buy. That was like the immediate thing I noticed first. But I was living in Texas and it was not available there at the time. So I actually had my dad, who was always in Florida, mule me back some new Riff. And I remember my first, I used to do like bourbon reviews and Scotch reviews and stuff back in the day on social media. And I remember literally writing that a new Riff on an old tradition. And it was up until that point, I was so entrenched in Kentucky bourbon that it was nice to kind of see a new take on it like that. And I guess my question to you is, now that I've seen what you all have done since then, and so much exploration, and so much trying new different things, how important is that for a new distiller like you guys to be embracing the idea of exploring versus kind of just trying to get out there and put out tried and true expressions that are safe? You know what I mean?
Sure. There's two sides to that coin, obviously. When we started up, our consultant was Larry Ebersold, who was from Seagram's fame. He'd been the master distiller over there for 25, 30 years. When he came in, and he was the one who trained myself, Jay, and David Miller, one of our early distillers, he said, all right, guys, if you guys are really going to like try to age this out for 4 years and not put out any of these like 2-year-old releases, then my suggestion to you is to figure out what this distillery is going to give you. I mean, we utilize open fermentation. Our windows are open. We kind of embrace like the geographical flavor of whiskey.
Yeah.
He said, what you guys want to do is stick with one barrel type for a couple of months, stick with one bourbon recipe and one rye recipe. First of all, even though none of us had any experience making whiskey, none of us had commissioned a distillery as well. So it was very important to like take those variables out of the equation in the beginning. So it was like, all right, let's figure out what the distillery is going to like, what we like the proofs coming off the stills at. We had to figure out what we like coming off the beer still. We had to figure out what we like coming off the doubler. We had to figure out, what we thought like the beer still could handle, fermentation, what kind of alcohols we wanted to send over to the still, et cetera, et cetera. So we were like very, very like non-exploratory in the first couple of months. But the minute that like, I feel like we kind of got the hang of how to actually run this distillery, that was probably the minute that we started asking Larry, hey man, like what was the favorite whiskey that you ever made? He's like, well, the favorite whiskey I ever made at Seagram's was 100% malted rye. That was a component of one of their blended whiskeys. So we were like, okay, well, good enough we call him Master Larry, like good enough for Larry, good enough for us. Like, let's try to see if we can never like bastardize this thing and make him like, just be like, what are you guys doing? But when we did that batch of 100% malted rye, we figured out like what our stills could handle. But also that's really what like, kind of like started like giving our focus to like other things. Like if our stills can handle 100% malted rye, why couldn't they handle 100% malted barley? And that was actually the inception of our single malt program, was at the end of 2014, which piggybacked off of making Larry's favorite whiskey. Once we got those two in the bag, we kind of really started looking around and figuring out, I don't know, like, I feel like we could do this, we could do that, we could do this, but we wanted to keep it like very controlled. I love the word experimentation, but like, it also has like kind of that connotation that like, you're just kind of throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah.
My training as a brewer was always just very based in like analytics and data collection and like R&D. So actually, like the very first whiskey that we wanted to like start to play around with, we shut down for Thanksgiving. I think you guys understand how much that we believe in sour mash, that we embossed it on our bottle. When you shut down a distillery, you don't have any more sour mash. So we started up and made a corn whiskey. And that corn whiskey, I thought, could be a pretty good vehicle to like put a couple of different malts in to figure out what we liked. Albeit like the whiskey that like resulted, still sitting in the warehouse. It's not my favorite, but it also showcased the fact that like not only could we process and distill some of these different grains, but that they might work. So we made a corn whiskey, I think, with like some chocolate malt and a couple other things. But it was more like that was our experimental type stuff of like figuring out what the stills could handle. When we figured out that there was really nothing that we couldn't break the still and then fix, then we really started like kind of reaching back into kind of my experiences as a brewer. But also at the same time, we had Jay Erisman. He's a slow food guy, and he loved the idea of heirloom grains. We worked with our farmer, Charles Fogg, who's 75, 80 miles from here, grows all of our non-GMO corn, but he also was growing things like Balboa rye, which, as we started, it was the proverbial rabbit hole when you start jumping into things. And like Jay and I had a really good rapport when we started really talking about these kinds of whiskeys that we wanted to make. And my background as a brewer really led to those kind of like avenues of looking at like what malted barley varieties could do, as to where he kind of brought forward like the heirloom grain type things. Don't get me wrong, like the farmers will grow heirloom grains. They're just going to charge you because they're such poor yielding crops. And, there's a reason there's genetically modified grains these days. But if you really want to like try to like reach back into like the history of like what things really tasted like before, whatever, that was a very good like kind of like lens of looking at those things. So kind of it was a twofold approach. I wanted to do a bunch of different things with all of the malts that I had worked with my entire life. He loved the heirloom varieties, and we just had we just kept riffing. And I know it sounds a little bit corny, but like there are so many of the ideas that are sitting in our warehouse right now that came up from Jay and I just like texting each other, like calling each other at like 10 p.m. Like, dude, did you ever think about this? And he's like, dude, I was just thinking about that stuff. So, when you like kind of like we got our sea legs underneath us, and we felt confident that we could make traditional bourbon and rye. That was, if you're going to have a name like New Riff, like I don't really know if it flies if you're going to just be like, well, here's 22% malt or
I guess so.
15% rye.
Here's a regular whiskey.
I mean, we just we pushed the envelope. I think a couple, like it's been said to us before, we didn't have any good habits, but we also didn't have any bad habits, and we didn't like have anybody tell us yes or no. Don't get me wrong, like we don't shoot 100%. We shoot a high percentage, but when you start getting into like kind of really exploring things, that's where I think like we kind of got into the breadth of like a lot of the raw materials that we want to work with. And that's again, like kind of like a shout out to Ken, who said, my job is to give you the best tools and let you guys figure out what the best raw materials. Like I want to give you guys the best things to work with, and that's your job. And that's, that's what we did. He also allowed the space to let things wait 4, 5, 6. I mean, when we were starting to taste our 6-year malted rye, we were at 4 years old. We were like, that's good. He was like, what about 5? And then we tasted at 5, and he was like, what about 6? And then we were like, what about 10? And so like, we're a business, don't get me wrong, but we're also kind of allowed to chase like quality and new ideas if it makes sense. And going back to kind of like the throwing things against the wall, that's never us. I think it's very detailed research and development, and having just a very deep understanding of a lot of the things that we're going to work with before we actually start to work with them. So I think that kind of gives us a little bit ahead.
Yeah. Well, I love that.
Well, I mean, you jumped into something that I'm a little curious about now. So you were talking about heirlooms and heirloom grains and everything that you guys are currently doing with that. So this is where we're going to get a little bit nerdy, but at the same time, we're going to drink a little now because we're really curious on the Balboa rye as well as the Bottle and Bond. You guys sent us those samples. So we're super excited to try both of them and go through both of them to see what your opinions are. But while we're drinking these, I want to get your opinion at the same exact time on the heirloom grains and exploring what you did with those? And are there going to be any new exploration into future releases with different types of grains that you're allowed to talk about?
Oh, I talk about whatever I want to.
Great. Perfect.
All right.
Everything.
I know, like when they like, you know, a funny tidbit, like, you know, a year and a half ago, and they were like, well, you're going to have to talk to people. I'm going to be like, are you ready for me to talk to people? Like a lot of like the things that like people think are secrets are things that are like to us, like are like 6 to 7 to 8 years old. So they're like not new things to us. So like when we tell people like, this is what we've got working in the warehouse, these are things that like 2016, 17, we've worked with Bloody Butcher, we've malted corn, we've done. We're working right now with one of our favorite small craft maltsters is Riverbend down in Asheville, North Carolina, where we work with them on some stuff. You know, if our farmer, Charles Fogg in Indiana, is capable of growing some of these things, we'll do it. I mean, I don't know if we've met a grain that if we can get the quantity and the quality, specifically speaking to heirloom varieties, if we can get the quantity and the quality that we want, we'll work with it. And a lot of the things that like in the past, we've kind of kicked ourselves, but that's just the nature of whiskey. Of we found something that we wanted to work with. Turkey red wheat is a great example. We had the opportunity to work with it. We made a batch, and we were so used to like high rye distillate coming off our stills that wheated distillate came off and it tasted pretty boring to us. We were like, oh man, like this isn't like a spicy big like yummy monster. This is just like, it's soft and it's a little bit buttery and it's bready. And then you taste those things after 2 or 3 years and you're like, wish I would have made more then. But those are the things that we revisit as well. So like now last year we made a couple 100 barrels of that wheated bourbon. But I don't, you know, again, I don't know if you had any like questions in particular about the heirloom grains, but I mean, if, like
I do.
Which one are you sipping on, Martin?
I've actually got the Balboa just since we were talking about heirloom. And I'm pretty much almost out of the I had the Balboa.
I have some tasting notes pulled up if you care to indulge.
Yeah. While I do that, I'm curious just because we're talking heirloom, and I do have a question about that. How do you feel about Bloody Butcher as a grain, as a corn?
What do you mean? How do I feel about it? Like,
so, I guess for me, it's been the one that I've had the hardest time with. Anything that has Bloody Butcher in it, I am having a very difficult time wrapping my head around the flavor profile, and I'm curious how you feel about that, specifically about that flavor. Versus, do you feel like it adds enough to warrant exploring with it, or is it one you're like, we could maybe make it or not?
Yeah, I mean, this is the beautiful part about transparency. When we work with some of the heirloom corns, in the past, we found a couple that we really, really liked. Blue Claridge and Yellow Leaming were examples that we thought that like brought something new. That, you know, we always use like our 4-year-old BIB bourbon as kind of the baseline for like comparing some of the heirloom varieties that we work with. We have worked with some, and I'm not going to just call out any poor variety of corn, but we have worked with some varieties where we're like, while it's made good whiskey, does it differentiate enough from just a standard bourbon whiskey? And I think like kind of like what's in our portfolio kind of shows like what we think are the things that like show themselves to be a little bit special, with the Blue Claridge and the Yellow Leaming and the Balboa rye. You know, we've made bourbon with a Brutzi rye. We've made bourbon with a Rustic. I think a lot of the things that like we think show a difference to us, we've already put out. That being said, like we haven't tasted Bloody Butcher in a while. We've also worked with malted Bloody Butcher.
Yeah. Oh, really?
You know, a lot of it goes down to how high quality of the raw materials that you get in. It depends on how your farmer is growing it, how he's cleaning it, how it's coming to you, what is your moisture. You know, all of those things are just so important. And, you know, thankfully, like Charles Fogg, our farmer, has been so willing to work with us that he is so tried and true. When I go back to like the Seagram's era of how when Larry worked there, I know Seagram's is not like associated like one-to-one with like these guys are just amazing. Like they're making like these amazing whiskeys or blends or things like that. But they are like some of the most like technologically like advanced, like data hounds back in the day. And he was trained like by them back in the day. Like this is what moisture should look like. This is what this should look like. So he was working with a lot of parameters. So he already had that ingrained in what he was doing. So then when he gets a couple of crazy guys like us coming along and be like, can you do this? He actually was able to apply a lot of the things that he was taught to growing some of these different heirloom varieties as well. I have high hopes for Bloody Butcher. We haven't tasted in a while, but a lot of these things, you know, they're such small percentages of our production. I know a lot of them grab so much of the headlines, but they're such a small piece. You know, I was looking back at our numbers the other day and I was like, oh, wow, like this thing that is so popular is like 3% of our yearly production, but like 3% of New Riff's yearly production is still a good chunk of like, good chunk of barrels.
You're talking about 100% of what ours is at 10th Mountain Whiskey. I mean, you just killed what we did. That's 3% of what you guys make a year, which is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we also tell people like we're a really big small distillery and a really small big distillery. I mean, I don't, you know, that's where I see ourselves sitting probably, hopefully forever.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that either.
What's that?
There's nothing wrong with that either.
I think we're in the right space and we're in the right size. I think we all know what's kind of going on in the whiskey world and the spirits world and the beer and wine industry as well right now. But like, you know, I think we're at a pretty good size where we're still adaptable, flexible, and we can still work with pretty much anything we want as well.
That's cool. That's awesome. I guess since we're talking about that, I think what I'm having is is almost like a cilantro reaction to Bloody Butcher. It's like, because I'll describe like what I'm getting from it. People are like, I'm into it. I enjoy it. I'm just like, it's just giving me that note that I just can't get past. And I never get like that with whiskey. I love off the wall, weird, all sorts of things, but it's the one grain, the one variety of corn that I just can't figure out. Maybe it's just it's just that cilantro effect. But we are drinking the Balboa. If you want to talk a little bit about this, because I really enjoy this one quite a bit.
Yeah. So I don't remember the actual year when we started making it, but again, shout out to our farmer Charles Fogg. He called us one day and said, "Hey, I've been growing this grain on our property for a long time. And they use it as a cover crop. Is this something like I see you guys are like all over the internet, like geeking out, like we love rye. And he's like, hey man, like I have some rye. So kind of we said, okay, we didn't like know anything about Balboa.
I was going to say, is there a story behind that? That was the first thing I told these guys. I was like, I want to know if there's like a story to the reference of the name.
Historical reference was our Charles called us. I think he talked to Jay. And he said, do you guys have any interest in making rye whiskey out of Balboa? And we said, I don't know. So we brought over, I think, 10,000 pounds and we made a batch. And we thought that it would be a 1-to-1 comparison to our standard rye whiskey. And when it came off the stills, I think all of us were very surprised at kind of how fruit forward this rye whiskey was compared to our other rye whiskey. We had a lot of those those learning moments. We always thought that like, all right, we're going to make 100% malted rye whiskey. This thing's going to obviously be the most spicy thing. But like, if you look back on if I look back at that and that's not true. Why would something so malted be so spicy?
Yeah.
Where it's more, fruity and cereally and malty, but this is a great example of like, what do you get out of like heirloom grains? We thought we'll try it. We made a batch of it. That batch made 12 barrels of whiskey. We really liked it off the still. We really loved the story as well. We liked Charles and he's such a great guy. But again, like these things take like 6 months to a year to like really like kind of like develop, start tasting them out of a barrel, figuring out what you're getting out of them. And then the next year rolled around and we were like, instead of, giving us 10,000 pounds, can you go seed a field with 10,000 pounds? And he said, yes. I mean, it's going to be exponentially more expensive because again, when you get to heirloom varieties, much shorter, much less of a yield, but he was willing to work with us. And then, Balboa was probably one of the best examples of, kind of something that's like graduated from New Riff. It started with a batch. We liked it. And then we made what was called a day of it. Back in the day, a day was like 40 barrels. We made 40 barrels. Liked it. We made 500 barrels of it last year. So it's become a chunk of our production. Wow, so that's where it kind of gets back into like trying to like figure out, targeting the flavors that we like, but also it all goes back to like the quantity and the quality of like the raw materials that you're bringing in as well. There's so many variables to make whiskey. Like myself, I consider like my job as a whiskey maker is to be as consistent in what I'm doing, but also like bringing the best raw materials forward, having like rock solid, like mashing, fermentation, distillation techniques, because, at the end of the day, people are chopping down 100-year-old trees, making a couple barrels out of it, lighting them on fire, and there goes Balboa rye into it. It's a calculated risk, but when you start with one batch and you start to like really like develop the story and understand what you really like, and I would say probably 95% of the people in this, at least the distilling team, like drink probably rye whiskey exclusively. It's just one of those things that like, as we've been able to tell our story, which is not a long story, this is one that's just kind of like tagged along with us. And like the public has picked up on it. They love it. And we're like, it's kind of one of those things we're like, oh, wow. Like, is it because Balboa is is it rocky or,
yeah.
I don't know. I don't question. I say, we're super proud of the whiskey that we've made, but it's those things that like turkey red wheat, like people just kind of like they latch onto, and those are the things that like are super exciting with us. We could have like been left with a very large pile of barrels. People are like, no one cares about heirloom grains. Why do you guys care about it? And we're like, yeah, that's a good point. I don't know. You still want to buy it? Like, but
because they taste good.
And I think that like and I don't know where the rye boom came from, because you're right. I mean, I think pretty much all of us, for sure, everybody on the podcast, every one of our friend group, especially within this whiskey community, we have in the last 2 years just like in a lot of ways almost exclusively like kind of gravitated to rye. And it's interesting. I mean, we spent, I would say that last summer, most of the distilleries we got to visit, the thing that we were going there for was their rye. And that was not something we ever really thought about in the past. Like it was always, for me, I started off in Scotch, Brian as well. Brian and I are big into Scotch, Adrian bourbon, Brian or Joe, a little bit of both. So going into bourbon was kind of a big step, but then going into rye was an even bigger step, but it wasn't really when I thought about it. Rye and barley they're both very fiery grains, they're both very flavorful grains. And there is a lot of crossover, and I think that's why I ended up back there. But it's very interesting for me, for people who still don't like single malt or don't like barley, anything made with barley in general, whether it's single malt, straight malt, whatever it is, that they still don't latch on to that, but love rye, or they're really getting into rye. So it's
I mean, you made an excellent point there. When we were over in the UK, I guess 2023. We're so hung up on we're like, oh my gosh, 20-year-old Springbank is so delicious. Like, don't get me wrong,
yes, it is.
Yeah, like it's one of my favorite distilleries ever. But like, we had the opportunity to go over there with a bunch of like kind of the iterations of what would become our malt whiskey, and we were able to taste, honestly, like a lot of our heroes on it. The one thing that like people, London, all the way over to Isla, they were like, we like rye whiskey.
Yeah, it's crazy.
4 to 5 to 6-year-old bourbon whiskey, because they're like, like what we love are like these so refined, like, oh my gosh, they're like, I digress. We all love Scotch, but for them to go, oh my gosh, I love rye whiskey. Like, we went to Brooklady and they were like, had like a bottle of rye whiskey that they made. like, oh my gosh. It's like, yeah. So like what we love is theirs, but like also like, I can see the appeal over there of like a fiery, like aggressive 4, 6, 8-year-old rye whiskey the same way as a bourbon. So that was very eye-opening to us as well, as far as like kind of going back over there and seeing like kind of the interest in American whiskey, which is exciting.
Especially, so you got to go to Springbank. It's wild, right? Like,
I mean, it's like going back into the 1700, and I don't even know when they started.
They still bottle their own stuff. They have a bottling line there. Like that wigs me out every time like I see pictures of them, because and people don't understand like why that's such a wild thing within like this industry to have everything in house, not just a few things, like
whole thing.
Literally from the minute that they get their grains, when they're using local barley and stuff like that, for their local barley expressions and things like that. But I mean, literally from that to when it's getting shipped, it's all Springbank. And I mean, they have not really changed their process dramatically in the last 40, 50 years. And that also leads to why they're so sought after, because their production's so low and it's hard to get them. But they also took like a year off to clean stuff too. So
I feel like, this might be a stretch, but like we went over there and, there are some nice things about being in the industry and having some connections. So we were able to go over and hang out with David, who's the vice president of sales at Springbank. But just to watch their operation and kind of like alluding to like a lot of what you said, at the end of the day, like we were tasting our rye whiskey with them and they were like, we love this. And we're like, can we sell you barrels? They're like,
yeah.
They're like, we'll send barrels over here and you guys can put Springbank in it. So about a year, we've been sending a couple 100 barrels over to Springbank, and there's
awesome.
Riff logo sitting in Campbelltown right now.
That's so cool, man.
I am so upset at you.
That is so
and
cool.
So excited.
It's so fucking cool.
I wanted to do that. Damn it.
You don't know, like Brian. You don't understand right now. You, Brian, newer Brian. Like,
sorry, I was saying goodbye. I just
wanted to make sure, because I'm like, oh, that's right, they have the same name. But you have no idea that when this comes out, when our friends in our group listen to this and find out that there's new Riff barrels sitting at Springbank, there's gonna be a lot of excited people, and that's what I love. It's that nerdy thing that gets people excited like that. Because for other people, like, so what? I'm like, no, you don't understand how cool that is.
Awesome. And they're like, well, yes, we're having trouble getting barrels. We're like, I'll pay you to take my barrels. Like, I love your whiskey.
Like, just make Springbank in these places. Like,
right?
That's so cool. That's super cool.
Fast friends.
Yeah, I'm telling you, Springbank has been my as hard as they are to get and as popular as they've become in the last however many years. They're still the best.
I think they call themselves the whiskey drinkers whiskey. This is also why I'm horrible for sales and marketing, because now we're just talking about Springbank.
Yeah, we're talking about something else while we're drinking yours. But I guess let's talk about the Balboa, because I am kind of thinking of some notes here too. So
very dark cherry for me.
Yeah.
So good.
That was like, again, when we go back to like kind of what we were surprised about, it was just, we expected it to be super spicy, clovey, cinnamony, black peppery, all the things that like we kind of associate our standard rye whiskey with. We thought were going to be very similar, but that just shows like kind of when you're working with different strains of rye, really we stuck to all of our same mashing techniques, fermentation curves were all the same, distillation proofs, they were all the same. The only variable in this entire whiskey that was different from our standard rye whiskey was the actual strain of rye. And that's why it was
it's absolutely wonderful.
It's 95.5, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So it's crazy because there is spice on the nose. Like, I mean, like it's the ones you're looking for, but you're right. It's not there. Clove for sure on the nose, like lots of clove, pepper.
When I started tasting rye whiskeys, a lot of what I was tasting was from MGP, and I was getting a lot of like the dill and the bacon grease and stuff like that. That's just what I like assumed rye whiskey like made in the Midwest tasted like. But then we haven't gotten a drop of dill whiskey really out of our rye
There's
whiskey.
no dill notes in it at all.
No.
We share common rye suppliers and all these things. That's why I think it's so important to like kind of like drill down into like what the geographical flavor of whiskey is. We use our own well. We're using our own water. We're using our own different fermentation techniques, and it's just very interesting to us as a distilling team and as well as a company. I'm like, how different one variable. And that's when you get into like what we were talking about with the heirloom varieties, like that one was like very easy for us to see. We're like, oh man, like that is the story right there. It's just so different and it's cool. And that's really all. Like we're just a bunch of nerds over here too, trying to find like cool stuff in the warehouse.
Well, you all aren't even that dramatically far from Starlight, and I get dill all over their rise, and they're obviously doing some interesting things. But you guys aren't dramatically far from. Yeah, great. When you guys aren't like super far from them as far as like geographically, but like it could two dramatically different rise.
Yep.
And it's just
that's the beautiful thing about whiskey. I mean, I really do think it's like kind of like that geographical flavor. I don't know if you picked up our distillery and dropped it over in Oregon. I don't know what you're going to get. Hopefully, you're going to get good whiskey, but I would assume it's going to be like different.
Although I've always wanted people to do that. I have like wanted like a mass like a trade between like American distilleries to trade in different regions. Give a barrel somewhere, like you would give a barrel to the Pacific Northwest gives one to Texas gives it to Colorado. Like I'd love for something like that to happen, to see what will come out of it, to see how really those types of things, like even elevation, Brian knows all about that for sure. How that affects how it affects a distillate like that, how it affects the wood. I just would love for something like that. But that's obviously a big undertaking. But I think
Brian, you and I need to talk after this podcast, because I would love to see what you and I could do together from our two distilleries and see if there's anything fun and exciting we can come out with.
Yep. I mean, we've going back into my background as a brewer, collaborations in breweries are extremely common.
Yeah.
The norm. I won't spill the beans, but we've been collaborating with a distillery for almost 7 years now. And the first release will probably see the light of day fall of this year.
No. Well, I think
that's exciting.
And it's cool the stuff you guys do with like Lost Lantern. I tried your newer the Lost Lantern one, and that was obviously it's newer, but I love that about indie bottlers, that's starting to happen here in the States as well. It's such an important thing for people to be able to see stuff from distilleries that they may not have exposure to.
I think a lot of things that like we're going to probably explore, like blended whiskey with such like it has such a negative like tag on it in America. Shouldn't be. I mean,
Compass Box.
I agree.
What's going on here? Like, it's just like you have like this backstory of like the connotation is that they're just it's a lower blend, it's a subpar blend or things like that. So we're like, why can't you blow the doors out of a blend and stuff like that? So a lot of those things are
really good things.
We as my job has evolved here over more than a decade now. We've hired a distillery manager I'm training him now. So he's going to be moving into the role of kind of just making the distillery like runs as it should. So I'll take a kind of a broader role of handling the warehousing and the distillery, and letting some other people kind of put their fingerprints on stuff. But also a lot of the things that we've worked on, we forget about. I mean, yes, we've got this incredible database and all these things, but like when you actually like just make all these things and put them away, it's very easy to forget. And that's like kind of like what I'm going to go back and a lot of what I like think that I know that I do really well is up front. And now like, I think the second piece of what I want to do is kind of learning on the back end of working with a lot of the things that we've made as well.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So we promised you a weird ass question. And we got it for you. I do have to set it up. Adrian's going to ask the actual question. This is something that we asked literally everybody.
Okay.
And the reason why we do this, I think you mentioned earlier about like blowing the doors off of something. So when we first started, when we first took over this podcast as hosts, we weren't always the original hosts. we were brainstorming. We used to like brainstorm like who are we gonna get on? Like who are we reaching out to? What is the show gonna look like? And during all of this, Adrian sitting where she is right now, and that door behind her that you see, through it came a squirrel, blew the door off of it, literally kicked it down, came in, stole a bunch of her stuff. None of this is true, Ryan.
It's pretty much.
I was like this squirrel is a human.
So none of this is true. But we do have a squirrel themed question every episode. We have no idea why we do it anymore. There was our actual reason. Now I just make up a lie every single time. So that way it's a new reason why we have a squirrel related question. So Adrian, take it away. We made it Balboa related.
Yeah, that was my idea. Let's see. So if Rocky Balboa was a squirrel, would he have won every fight?
Would he be the Floyd Mayweather?
He probably has the same reading capabilities. Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
I think we're officially having bourbon with friends now.
Yeah. This is awesome.
Well, didn't like 50 Cent like do a thing like where he trolled him? Like he told him if you like read Harry Potter, No, you never heard that. So 50 Cent trolled Floyd Mayweather and said to him, he said, if you can read this passage from Harry Potter, he's like, I'll donate like $10 million or something to a charity. And he couldn't do it.
He got that.
I mean,
That's why I made
that
the joke.
concussions and you're that short. Your blood doesn't.
That's the toughest question. I mean, I got an answer. Like,
there we go.
No, he wouldn't. Like, if Balboa whiskey was a squirrel, would he be undefeated?
Mm-hmm. He's not going up. He's not going up against like Jake Paul or anything like that. So,
I mean, that's not a hard.
Well, I'll say this. I'll say no, because even like while we sit and taste through all these barrels of Balboa that became this blend, we didn't think some of them were ready. We didn't think some of them were. I don't know necessarily worthy is the right term for it, but like they didn't like work within the blend. And now, it's perfect.
I know. I so think we need like some kind of like one-off Balboa where it's a squirrel, Balboa squirrel, but it's yelling Adrian, and there's a little Adrian coming through the door behind it.
This is why the sales and marketing team decided we were all a good fit for each other.
You know what I mean?
Right?
You know what I mean? Oh, that's good. That's a great answer. It's a stupid question. We understand that, but it also kind of breaks things up because we get super nerdy sometimes.
Can I ask you a stupid question?
Yes, I love.
Yes.
Would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses?
No.
100 duck-sized horses.
Yep. That's
Yep.
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 Not that's what I'm saying.
Fuck that.
Yeah.
No thanks.
You guys are saying you have a better chance against something that's not a dinosaur.
Yeah,
Pretty much.
I'm not going after fucking what is that? A velociraptor?
Basically.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, kind of.
I mean,
birds are prehistoric.
Yeah.
The right answer is you guys are right.
Is it
awesome?
I hunt for a living.
We can ride it though. Like it'd be kind of cool to ride like a big.
Ooh, that might be something. I bet it flies too.
Our thought was you could pick up the small little horses and beat the other horses with it.
Just toss them.
And also, aren't horses
you could kick them. You could kick them
around and scare them too.
I wonder if you could. No, it's not that. I want to put like what's that old altar that you saw on 300 where they were all carrying the emperor?
Oh Jesus!
Yeah,
no, I know. Yeah, one of those things.
I want to get that, but put the horses underneath it so you can have that. Just go around.
The Ark of the Covenant.
No. Yeah. Wars would have looked different if they were duck size. Like,
those are two good questions.
You can see them coming over the ridge. You're like, oh, they're coming, sir, and they're like, the fuck are they riding?
Where are you? Are they roller skates?
Are they skating on those ducks? That's
So,
good. That's a good question. We've never had someone ask us a question, by the way, guys.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Oh, that's all
That
I do
was
is just ask. Somebody asks me something I don't know. I'm like, why?
That's good. That's awesome.
Well, Martin, we were talking earlier about the all matte black bottle. I have a bottle of the winter whiskey here. Do you want to talk a little bit about where the all matte black idea comes from? And
sure. So around, I guess, 2017, when we kind of started looking through the bourbon binoculars of, we're going to have to put out whiskey soon.
Yep.
We better start working and designing. We worked with a couple different companies, but we landed on one. I'm not going to throw any names out, but a lot of the credit of that initial design goes to Hannah Lowen, who was our longtime GM, who's now the CEO of the company. She really led a lot of that design effort. I would love to take a ton of credit, but we were fortunately some of the people that were like just sent the kind of the drafts of like, this is what we're working on. And they just looked really, really cool.
Yeah.
I can take credit for a lot of what went into the bottle, but we have, a lot of forward thinking people. And just when we saw that initial bottle, the initial bottle design, we just all kind of fell in love with it. Winter whiskey itself, that name was argued over quite a bit. We didn't know what the heck to call it. To me, when I first saw it, I said, that kind of looks like a wedding invitation type thing to me.
Yeah.
But then I looked at it more and it just kind of grew on me. So in short,
it's very tasty also.
Thank you. Hannah Lowen, our wonderful CEO, kind of was like the driving force behind a lot of that early bottle design. And honestly, still to this day, has a very broad impact on a lot of the design
and it stands out. I mean, that's the thing. Like, there's so many bottles that look relatively the same. Yeah. Especially in Scotch. I mean, you go like this, especially like if you look like Isla bottles. Obviously, that was by design. They had the green, the green tinted bottles to like, because people would be like, well, why is it so light? Yeah. But at the same time, like, you walk down an aisle, New Riff's catching my eye. I mean, like, there's no way I'm not seeing New Riff. Like, I still do that all the time. Like, I walk down the aisles and like, I'm like, oh, which bottles are this one. And New Riff has always been amongst those. And I
have
just
you guys seen any of the high note releases that we have?
I actually have. Yeah.
So as much as I love this, I also love like the clear with the blue and the cream label. I just, shout out to them, like to all, like they do such a good job of the design. I'm very fortunate for everyone around here to trust me with the liquid that's going into the bottle. And it's just, honestly, it's so awesome to watch other people work with like what the actual like design elements are and kind of the bottle design and how the labels work out. Yeah. It's awesome because as much as I think that like we can make really good whiskey, if you left me to design a bottle, I'd be like, here's a milk jug with whiskey in it. It takes every piece of this company to kind of put this package together, and all the way from like people bottling it to the people that are barreling it, rolling all the barrels. I mean, we're a small little village, and I think one thing that just runs through this company as a whole is just how genuinely like happy people are to like be part of this, which is a small independent. There's not a lot of us anymore, especially not in Kentucky. I mean,
not independent anyway.
Like that.
No.
That's all the big guys are taking over, which is fine. They have their place, obviously.
Sure.
Brian,
but
we always have one last question for every single guest. And Adrian, myself, Martin, Joe, I think this is our favorite question for everybody. And the reason for that, I'll give a little context. It gives a little backstory on who you are, a little bit more in depth, but gives a little fun idea of everything that you have perceived about whiskey or spirits in general. The question is what's your favorite whiskey memory or spirits memory that you have in mind? It could be from the past, it could be current, it could be from when you were a child, seeing someone else drink, or when you were drinking as a child. Who fucking knows? We all grew up in different experiences. We did enjoying spirits. So you could state across the board but what's your favorite whiskey or spirit memory?
That's easy. There's two of them, and they both come out of New Riff. Obviously, since we had zero experience making whiskey, starting from the ground up and with New Riff, probably one of the most terrifying and rewarding things was starting to taste our whiskeys at 3.5 years old, knowing that we were going to come out of the gate as a new distillery out of Kentucky with a 4-year-old bonded product. It was terrifying. It was rewarding. It was all of like the good and the bad emotions rolled into one. Sending all of our samples to like different people locally that we wanted to get their opinion on, just knowing that like we had waited and we had done the right thing, and that like patience actually, it paid off for us. That 4-year-old batch number 1 bottled and bond bourbon is probably the favorite whiskey that I've ever worked on, put together, et cetera, because those were all firsts for me. They were all parts of like batch 1. They were all parts of like working with Larry while the time that he was here. There's so much learning that went into that liquid, that went into that bottle, that it's my favorite. A very, very, very close second is like the exact opposite is the single malt whiskey. Because that program grew with us throughout over a decade. And again, like we started making malt whiskey in 2014, not really knowing what direction we were going to go in. We just knew we wanted to do it. And the exploration that we continue to like, just let's do this, let's do that. Let's start doing this. Let's start doing that. And honestly, like a lot of it was like, F it, we're going to figure it out in the end, working with different casks, like putting that complex, in our opinion, that complex of a puzzle together with something that we really, really, really enjoyed and we're proud to put out. That's a very close second. Don't get me wrong. Single malt whiskey is not going to keep the lights on around New Riff. Bottled and bond and all of our other expressions are. Of course. You kind of have like that baby of that first bottled and bond batch of bourbon, and then subsequently like rye, but also like the other end of the spectrum was like where we learned how to blend and work with like different kinds of whiskeys and kind of put something out there that we thought was absolutely 100% unique to New Riff. Yeah. I think it's I think love it or hate it, I think that's unmistakable New Riff whiskey, the single malt whiskey. We're very, very proud of like all of the bonded whiskeys. You know, the goal will be to get to 8 and subsequent years upwards. We'll try to go bonded. You know, we're going to play around with cast strength and all of these other things, but like the blending of those first batches of learning we did everything with bourbon, and then on the other end of the spectrum of working with everything else that seemed to us like so complex, but also that's like awesome. Shout out to Ken as well, you know, and we're like, so we did all this stuff, man. We're not quite like, we got an idea. And he said, you guys have the connections, go visit your heroes. And away we went. And you know, when we got there, they didn't tell us what to do. They just said, you Americans and your big ass whiskeys, but like this is yours and they're good, and do what you want to do with them. And that was the inspiration that we took away from our trip over there.
That's awesome. And it's kind of, I mean, it's seeing the people that influence you. And I'm actually super jazzed now to know that like I had the bottled and bond, and I remember that on the around the top I had a distilled in 2015. So that means I had a relatively younger one. Or relatively probably one of those that you're kind of almost referring to. So that's pretty cool. And I mean, I think we love these. I mean, that's why we asked this is Bourbon with Friends, right? But everybody has that starting point of that memory that really just kind of sticks in their mind. And we've heard some really awesome ones over the past like almost a year now. And yours was no different. That was an amazing memory. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Brian, I know Adrian, Martin, and myself and Joe in the background are more than thrilled with everything that you have provided us, especially these amazing samples, and not including that, but the stories and knowledge bases that you've actually given us. And then the fucking great question first off, and then the answer second for our squirrel question. was fantastic. But we really want to thank you for joining Bourbon with Friends. And no matter where you're at in the world, guys, just remember, a bourbon with friends or whiskey can change the world. We really appreciate it, y'all. Thank you. Have a great day.
That's it for this episode of Bourbon with Friends. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. While you're at it, leave us a review to make it easier for others to find the show. You can also check us out on Instagram at Bwfpodcast. Thanks for listening.